Thank you very much for coming. I know that there are opportunity costs involved in every decision, and you could be a number of places this evening, and I'm happy that we are here together to talk about Ludwig von Mises' Human Action. This is probably the only college campus I've ever spoken at where the students have read Human Action probably as many times as I have, so this makes our time together unique. This is the 75th anniversary of the publication of Human Action, which also makes this particular topic important. As you know, because you have all read it, Human Action is a long work that encapsulates the core principles of the Austrian School of Economics, named for the Austrian national background of such prominent exponents as Karl Menger, Eugene von Bomborg, Friedrich von Weiser, and Friedrich von Hayek. The book can be considered a treatise on epistemology from which economic conclusions flow. Mises begins, after all, with epistemological questions, examining the nature and limits of knowledge. This starting point is crucial because it lays the foundation for two key concepts in Austrian economics. The first is praxeology, or the study of human action based on a priori concepts and their logical relationships, rather than historical analysis, as in Marxism with its account of historical materialism. The second is methodological individualism, or the proposition that only individuals and not collective groups act. These premises are indispensable to our understanding of the Austrian approach to economics and human behavior. From them, Mises extrapolates ideas aimed at promoting peace and prosperity while minimizing war, violence, and coercion. The paradox of planning is that it cannot plan, Mises declared, because of the absence of economic calculation. What is called a planned economy is no economy at all. It is just a system of groping about in the dark. For Mises, central planning relies on assuming that a small group of leaders can know enough to intelligently and efficiently allocate society's scarce resources. Yet reality is unpredictable. Even capable business owners and investors can't precisely forecast consumer or industry demands. They make educated guesses, but often err. The free market is antithetical to central planning. It isn't perfect, but is merely, in Mises' words, the best solution accessible to the human mind under the given state of technological knowledge and the intellectual abilities of the age's shrewdest men. In a free market system, an entrepreneur willingly pursues various ideas. Some work, some don't. In the aggregate, the ones that don't are competitively eliminated. Meanwhile, prices act as signals conveying information about demand and scarcity. Rising prices indicate to businesses that they can profitably produce more of a good, whereas falling prices signal to them to produce less. Embracing this complex process, which is spread across millions of people, all using local tacit knowledge, is more efficient than having one small group try to plan the whole economy. The system, unplanned as it is, channels the dispersed knowledge that no one person or group of people could possess. Another focus of human action is a concept much discussed today: inflation. Mises prefers to speak of the purchasing power of money. Why? Because money's value is always changing, affected by both inflationary and deflationary pressures. People typically use the term inflation or deflation only when these changes are large enough to be noticeable, but they're always present. Mises explains that inflation occurs when the quantity of money in circulation increases. He warns that the inflationary process unfolds in stages and can take years, escaping notice until it's too late. A recent example would be COVID-19 relief funds, which were injected into the United States economy supposedly to stimulate it, while the Federal Reserve kept interest rates at artificially low levels, at near zero, in fact, to excite borrowing and spending. Instead of invigorating the economy as intended, these measures caused rising commodity prices. And rather than blaming monetary policy for the resulting inflation, politicians and bureaucrats blame COVID, which, lacking any agency, cannot be held morally responsible for the consequences of political or policy decisions. Central banks are a primary target of Mises's criticism because they attempt to solve self-inflicted problems through credit expansion and the disruption of natural trade cycles. By lowering interest rates through credit expansion, they provide only temporary relief, leading to net negative consequences. Central banks, in collaboration with government officials, historically concentrated precious metals like gold or silver in their reserves, creating dependency among private banks. As a result, private banks maintain less cash on hand while nonetheless projecting an appearance of solvency, relying on the central bank for bailouts whenever runs on deposits occurred. Over time, this led to critical instability throughout the banking system. Mises championed the gold standard, putting him at odds with economists who favored fiat currency, such as we have today, for easier manipulation of the money supply. Mises despised war, which he viewed as antithetical to a market economy. What the incompatibility of war and capitalism really means, he wrote, is that war and high civilization are incompatible. He advised that we discard the ideology, whatever it may be, that generates war. So my topic is, should conservatives still read human action, even though Ludwig von Mises wasn't a self-described or orthodox conservative? I actually personally consider myself a conservative, but I also consider myself a libertarian. I consider myself a student of Russell Kirk, but also a student of Hayek and Mises and Rothbard. And I think the answer to the question whether conservatives should still read human action is emphatically yes. Its ideas have the potential to unite diverse factions within the right, most notably those exemplified by the contrasting free-con and nat-con statements of principles. So some of you may not be aware because you're not as immersed in United States politics as I am, but there are competing statements of principles. The National Conservative Movement arose a few years ago, and they have their statement of principles. And in response to that, a movement called the Freedom Conservatives announced their statements of principles as well. Interestingly enough, I put both statements into artificial intelligence and said, tell me the key differences and similarities between these statements. And actually, AI generated much more similarity than it did difference. And I find that to be fascinating. However, among national conservatives, you'll see some support for industrial policy, trade, tariffs, and then among the free cons, you'll see different perspectives on immigration. Economically oriented libertarians often ignore cultural concerns, tolerating libertinism and even showing antipathy towards tradition, religion, and family. On the other side, nat-cons tend to claim that libertarian policies have dominated the right for decades, despite clear contrary evidence of the federal government's continuous growth. This steady state expansion has resulted in a pervasive managerial welfare state that intervenes in all aspects of daily life. Most self-identified conservatives in the United States occupy a middle ground, I think, acknowledging the importance of both economic growth and good values for societal stability and order. Economic prosperity and moral values are, in fact, interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Conservatives who prioritize social values and morality require a thriving economy to support their goals. Equally, advocates of free market principles need a society rooted in ethics, justice, and strong social values for their economic objectives to succeed. In essence, a healthy society depends on economic vitality and moral foundations working in tandem. Free markets are great, but if you have society full of really bad people, really unethical people making immoral choices, well, then the free market's not going to cause these people to thrive. People have to be self-governing. People uh, have to order their own lives according to norms and values in order to prosper and flourish. There are some species of conservatism that idealize a way of life based in close-knit, tribal-like communities, following strict religious and moral teachings, remaining isolated from mainstream commercial society, prioritizing strong bonds between community members, and cultivating eternal values. Conservatives who follow this outline might believe that prosperity leads to luxury, which invariably results in moral decay, and that poverty, while challenging, preserves moral integrity. This romanticized vision for society holds that living in relative poverty but maintaining high moral standards is preferable to achieving material wealth at the cost of spiritual harm. The reality, however, is that prosperity can coexist with and nourish moral and spiritual health. Actual poverty looks less like a communitarian utopia and more like methamphetamine abuse, fentanyl overdoses, political corruption, bad education, declining health, shortened lifespans, poor housing conditions, and dependence on government programming. Social and religious conservatives should study human action because economic freedom is necessary for preserving the family and culture while strengthening community ties, whereas inflation and economic instability erode moral foundations. In turn, free market advocates should promote cultural conservatism to counter state intrusion into family and community affairs. The family acts as a defense against the welfare state, preserving non-state institutions and voluntary private activity. Inflation undermines purchasing power and financial stability, increases stress on family and community commitments, raises education costs, widens the wealth gap, reduces intergenerational transfers from parents to children, undermines retirement security and elder care, and encourages career choices based on financial concerns over vocation, promoting materialism over human solidarity and tradition. Social problems like rampant crime are partly attributable to poor economic policies. Economic instability correlates with higher divorce rates, increased mental health problems and domestic violence, delayed marriage and parenthood, reduced fertility rates in wealthier groups, weakened nuclear family structures, and cohabitation over marriage due in part to high housing costs, right? In the United States, at least, a lot of young people can't afford housing. They take on heavy student loan burdens. The interest rates are high on mortgages. They can't afford to buy houses. And so they shack up with their significant other rather than waiting for marriage because it's too expensive to delay that cohabitation. The welfare state exacerbates these issues by undermining the nuclear family, replacing community support with government bureaucracy, politicizing daily life, altering time-tested values and family structures, and incentivizing divorce through state provisions to single parents and other deleterious domestic arrangements. Many Americans are increasingly focusing on their education and their work and their career as their primary sources of happiness. They're trying to find their identity and their occupation. 71% of Americans, according to Pew Research, believe having a satisfactory job or career leads to fulfillment, whereas only 23% view marriage as a path to the same type of fulfillment. Men present an even starker scenario. About 1 in 4 men from ages 25 to 54 is not working full-time in the United States. That's 25% of men between the ages 25 and 54 not working full-time. And guess what? These men are less likely to marry and more likely to divorce when they do get married. For free markets to function effectively, a moral and virtuous population is essential. And this is kind of common sense, right? Markets require trust and cooperation. If there's any type of diminished willingness to transaction with other people, then there's going to be a reduction in market efficiency, right? If people don't want to enter into contracts because they don't trust people, then that's going to affect the state of commerce in society. And it's also going to increase costs required to enforce contracts or to monitor compliance with contractual terms. A society that's morally compromised also leads to widespread corruption. A corrupt society is not fit for markets, unfortunately. A society full of lies and misinformation can produce market inefficiencies, misallocations of resources, lack of trust. This is a moral problem. This is why we need a moral and virtuous population. People who have shared values and norms tend to collaborate and cooperate more easily, more efficiently, more effectively. Unethical practices are more rampant in society, obviously, with immoral behaviors. And people with low moral standards are less likely to enter into not just contracts, but also long-term business relationships. Human action does not prescribe moral terms. It is not a book of ethics. It is not a book that teaches moral values. In fact, Mises is sort of politically amoral, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But human action is properly part of the conservative tradition. Anyone espousing traditionalism will benefit from carefully analyzing it to appreciate its place in the conservative tradition and relevance for today's conservatives. Conservatives contemplating human action may also enjoy Mises's other works, such as Nation, State, and Economy, which align with conservatism. Examining Mises's broader oeuvre helps bridge apparent gaps between libertarian and national conservative thought. Mises supported peaceful nationalism based on a people's right to self-determination and solidarity. He characterized nationalist movements as populist bulwarks against elite rule, a position that led him to oppose European colonialism, seeing it as a brutal obstacle to self-determination. On the other hand, in Human Action, he decried aggressive nationalism, which he called, quote, the necessary derivative of the politics of interventionism and national planning, end quote. In Human Action and Nation, State, and Economy, Mises warns that economic nationalism breeds conflict and hinders international cooperation, yet he recognizes the importance of social cohesion in resisting tyrannical government, advocating a form of nationalism that combines economic liberalism with locally embedded culture and nested values. Economics, in Mises's view, is a tool of analysis that reveals how humans tend to act in their own economic interests. So as a tool, economics is morally neutral, right? A car can be used in a moral way to take somebody who's sick to the hospital or to assist people in other ways. But it can also be used as a getaway car from the scene of the crime. It can be used in immoral purpose. Economics, similarly, is a tool. It's a vehicle that can be used for good or can be used for bad. While he treated economics as value neutral and apolitical, Mises believed that it provided a foundation for social values to thrive. Human Action expounds how economic knowledge is fundamental to modern civilization, underpinning the moral, intellectual, technological, and medical advancements of recent centuries. This knowledge, Mises contends, is a valuable resource at humanity's disposal, and the choice of whether to use it wisely lies with us. He concludes Human Action with a stark warning namely that ignoring economic principles won't negate their existence or impact. Overlooking them, in fact, could lead to the downfall of society. That's a very dark, a very existential message to end on. If we, quote, fail to take the best advantage, quote, of economics and, quote, disregard its teachings and warnings, he cautions, we will not annul economics, but eventually stamp out society and the human race. That's how important Mises thought economics was to the future of humans on this planet. This ominous line underscores Mises' view of economics as not merely a dense academic discipline, but existentially necessary for our survival. We ignore it at our peril. Thank you very much. I am happy to take questions. Thank you.
Well, hi. Thanks for having the talk.
Thank you.
So while Mises doesn't regard any moral arguments in his writings, a lot of the libertarian thought is also based around not having the government intervene. But you mentioned that a lot of the modern conservatives also want to not impose, but guarantee certain moral values in society. So how do you reconcile that with keeping the government out of moral decisions?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question, and it's a troubling issue, especially in the United States, as the conservative movement is in a period of fracture. Historically, I'd say since the conservative movement became a thing, which was, the 1950s is really when it emerged in the United States. Of course, conservatism being what it is, necessarily did not spring out of a vacuum. It's always dependent on traditions and customs and antecedents. But in the United States, historically, conservatism promoted free markets and limited government. And we're in a period of disruption in which many purported conservatives are embracing government power as sort of a mechanism for imposing social values or seeking to use the administrative state in particular as a weapon against enemies. I think this is mistaken for a number of reasons. Number one is I don't think power itself is in any way part of the conservative tradition at all. I don't think power is a good thing. I think that the American founding is a very promising period in history and a product of Enlightenment thought. I tend to think the Enlightenment was a very good period of history. You have conservatives like Patrick Deneen at the University of Notre Dame who dismiss the American founding period as being too liberal and saying that was a bad period and that it invariably led to the type of liberalism that we have today that takes the form of identity politics and LGBTQ rights and transgender politics. And I just don't see any sort of line that connects, I don't know, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, to any of those things whatsoever. To me, that's a very tenuous connection. But I think conservatism, being what it is, taking the long view, will eventually return to markets for the very reasons that I just described. If society is going to prosper and flourish, it has to account for economic principles and economic teachings. That does not mean that it has to make them the number one priority. It really doesn't. I love that economics are a high priority in American history. And I think that economic principles and social values and teachings ought to operate in tandem because I think they are mutually reinforcing. I hope that answers the question. Yes.
Yes. First of all, thanks for your time. I wanted to ask something. Like, having read the works of Mises, do you think that the way he goes about presenting things could deter people from reading them or not? Like, I feel personally, I personally feel like the way he presents his ideas is just too negative. Like he's always complaining and claiming that others are just wrong. But how is that like? Do you think that's not a good idea, or like a
Well,
good?
yeah, so I guess the question is optimism or pessimism a better rhetorical strategy? And I think it depends. And I think, I think there's a place for both optimism and pessimism. I think in the current circumstances, young people tend to gravitate towards optimism. I know in politics in the United States, candidates who are exuberant, and Kamala Harris is now predicating her campaign on the phrase or on the word joy. And people do gravitate to sort of happy things. I think less, Mises's appeal to a broader audience is less about optimism or pessimism and more about density. I mean, Mises is difficult to read. Human Action is not for everybody. It's not a book that is just going to get picked up in an airport bookstore and read. It presupposes a pretty high degree of economic knowledge and philosophical understanding. And so somebody who's unequipped with that knowledge coming into the text is unlikely to get much out of it. So I think that's more of an impediment to Mises's message than is his pessimism.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you again for your speech. I had a question. You mentioned that people tend to associate prosperity with moral decay and poverty with high moral values. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that note?
Yes, that is a particular species of conservatism. In particular, those who advocate sort of a romanticized version of return to a communal or tribal community. So this is not the popular perception among most people. This is a particular variety of conservatives who think that. Have you heard of the Benedict option? It's a teaching that became popular among many Catholic groups, where they thought they would just withdraw from society, kind of like in the John Galt way, from Rand, but that they would withdraw from society and just live religious, spiritual, ascetic lives, and that the greater commerce and cosmopolitanism that happens around those societies will just be have no effect on their day-to-day activity, and that they would be better off in that lifestyle, that poverty would cause them to live more morally than they would if they enjoyed luxury, because if they had luxury and wealth, they would spend it on pornography or they would spend it on distracting entertainment rather than on things that are morally uplifting. And I disagree with this. I don't think this is, in fact, true. I think that we, of course, can enjoy morality and increase prosperity and technology. In fact, how many people that are Christian read the Bible on their iPhones every day? It makes it immediately accessible to people all over the globe. So no, I actually don't buy into this notion, but there is a species of conservatism that adheres to it.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to ask something. In the book of Liberalism of Mises, I know we're talking about human action, but I want to talk about liberalism. He mentions that there is a fake movement of liberalism. What are your thoughts about the conservatives that are like misinformation, giving misinformation about this fake liberalism?
Could you say what the misinformation was about? I missed the last part.
Yeah, maybe because the conservatives are like fighting against the same conservatives, like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the state of conservatism is one of fracture and division right now in the United States, in particular around matters of economics, industrial policy. Trade is a big one. I think both Democrats and Republicans are advocating economic policies that aren't that far apart. They're not that far apart on matters of trade, on matters of tariffs. There's an emphasis on trying to bring industry back home, resurrect manufacturing, and completely ignoring economic principles like comparative advantage that would suggest that not only is it greater for us to engage in commerce for economic reasons, but also for matters of peace and prosperity, right? You're much less likely to go to war with a country with which you enjoy a trade partnership. So there are diplomatic reasons to embrace trade as well. As for the misinformation part, I presume that's about kind of economics and stuff like that. Usually when I hear the term misinformation and disinformation in the United States, it's always about election fraud and election integrity and that sort of thing. But I actually think that there are many conservatives who are well aware that there are certain economic principles that lead to peace and prosperity and material well-being, but they actually are willing to set those goals aside in favor of other goals. And I think that's problematic. I think these goals have to be placed at least on the same level. But again, I think markets work most effectively when you do have a virtuous populace. And I think the United States is in a period of decline. I think both morally and economically, the United States is probably on the wane. I hope to be proven wrong.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi, good afternoon.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I'd like to build upon what you were saying before about how there's this branch of conservatism that kind of says we have to go back on living more simple lives
Yes.
in a more trivial style. I find that there's a lot of younger people, maybe more liberal people, that agree with that idea and think we should go back to more simpler ways of living, and stop economic growth and in such a way that it would allow us to be kinder to the planet and be kinder, I suppose, go back morally in such a way that we can live more simpler lives. And I find that to be in two opposite sides of the spectrum, but somehow meeting in the middle. I would like to hear your opinions on how that divide could be breached.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of Henry David Thoreau and his teaching to simplify. Actually, there's nothing wrong with wanting to simplify life. And people who wish to voluntarily remove themselves from society to live aesthetic lifestyles are able to do that if they wish. If that's what they choose to do, and it's not done under compulsion or coercion, I find nothing problematic with that. What I do find problematic is elevating that as an ideal toward which everyone ought to aspire, or seeking to impose some sort of government mandates or programs that would mobilize society in that direction. I don't think that's very helpful at all. As for uniting left and right, one area where I think that can happen is in the area of the environmental, social, and governance movement, or ESG. I think ESG is a really big problem. I don't think ESG is a good thing at all. There are 100 trillion assets under management globally, and about 3 asset management firms control roughly $25 trillion of assets under management. Well, Forbes just released its list of billionaires, and there are only just over 3,000 billionaires in the world, just over 800 in the United States. You just can't mathematically get to $100 trillion of assets under management with private wealth. Not possible. Where does the money come from? It comes from government. It comes from government bonds. They could be municipal bonds. It comes from government pension money, state and federal pension money, the pension systems of many countries. It comes from sovereign wealth funds, oil-rich nations that have sovereign wealth funds. And this is how you get that type of astronomical figure. And what these asset management firms do is then they go buy large shares of publicly traded corporations and become engaged shareholders, and they push companies in a leftward direction. So they actually exercise compulsion against private industry, but they also buy shares of publicly traded companies that are most likely to receive government money, government subsidies. So they're investing government money on the front end, and then in a loop, they're getting government money on the back end through their shares, and it's a giant wealth extraction scheme. And I think if you buy into the idea that all of a sudden these corporate CEOs and the United Nations and the principles of responsibility management, et cetera, are all of a sudden discovering new moral principles, then you're kind of falling for a ruse. It's a little bit of a misleading premises. And I think really these companies are just basically exemplifying a historical, traditional public choice problem. These are just companies doing what companies tend to do, which is use the governmental system to gain privileges and competitive advantages. If you think about ESG as an example, incumbent firms love it. The bigger the company, the more they like it because they can afford the cost of compliance, whereas any competitor company trying to break in can't do it because they can't afford the cost of compliance. So in short, I could talk about ESG for a long time, but I think ESG is an example of a space where left and right might actually find some common ground if the left sort of woke up to what was going on. I know the right in the United States is very opposed to ESG, at least certain segments of the right. But on the left, you don't have that so much. You might get some small group of far left protesters showing up at BlackRock and protesting greenwashing or something, but it's not as common as it should be. Thank you. That's a good question. Yes.
Hi. I had a question about, you mentioned that the market is politically amoral in the sense that it's just a tool for progressing as a society, but leading to using that as a base, we can say that we can go either in a good or bad path.
Yeah, so let me just revise the statement a little bit.
Yeah.
It's economics that is morally
economics.
neutral, but markets consist of people.
Yeah.
So people are acting agents, and the one predicate of human action is that only individuals act. And in the aggregate, those actions add up to a sum that may have moral tendencies or immoral tendencies. So markets, I think, are full of moral examples and tendencies and trends, and markets can tend toward moral directions or immoral directions. I don't think pornography is necessarily a moral thing, right? I don't know that it teaches people good behaviors or improves anybody's quality of life. But it's part of a market, and I don't think governments should overregulate it.
Yeah, and that leads me to my question.
Okay.
That it's, how can we break the negative cycle? What can the society as a whole do to break that negative cycle, or the person as an individual do to break that negative cycle? And how can we try to install that positive one?
So is the cycle more a moral?
Yeah,
cycle? So
I wrote down a cycle because it made more sense in my head, but I don't think you actually said it. I mean, as in a good economic base leads to moral people, which leads to a better economic base, which leads to better people, and that way you can also have a negative cycle with the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I actually am not sure that that good economics necessarily leads to moral people, but I am confident that a moral people pursuing good economics leads to good moral and economic outcomes. But if you have bad people pursuing good economic policy, I'm not sure the economic policy will bear out in the long run, because I'm just not sure for all those reasons. Lack of trust among market participants. It's going to lead to misallocation of resources, market inefficiencies. If there can be no trust among market transactions, if people don't have incentives. I mean, we all know that incentives are essential to economics. One major incentive is that people want to provide for their families. People want to earn money because they want to have better lives for their children and for their grandchildren. And they want to make their communities a better place. People love where they're from. They want to improve their homes. They want to improve their communities. They want to make people's lives better. And those are moral incentives that contribute to good economic policies. I really think that culture is almost prior to economics. I think a focus on culture and values is important. Now, I also am not going to sit here and prescribe what that would exactly look like. And there are certainly examples of societies that pursued morality toward destructive ends. I mean, you think of just the big example of history is, the Spanish Inquisition, where morality was taken to immoral ends. And so there are examples of tyranny, certainly in the name of morality, and that's also a direction that we want to avoid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I thank you for your time, and I have a question. And since you replied to a question that was made ago, you mentioned that you accept people who have a lifestyle different from the rest, but you find a problem when they try to impose to the government some movements. But don't you think that that's a way to express or deal that some ideas that are not shown or work in our society, for example, different kind of thinkings or acting? Thank you.
Yeah, say a little bit more about. Give me some examples of what you mean, if you can. So I have a more concrete.
That was more like my question, since there's different kind of people that live a different lifestyle, but they try to impose some movements. For example, that was actually what I was trying to figure out. Where you were saying, since there's different kind of people like showing some realities to the government, and since I think Nina was the one who made the question, and she was saying that, for example, in some ways the government doesn't, or the people try to live simplest lifestyles.
Yeah.
So how would you try to focus more on that question that was made by Nina?
Yeah, so I guess to elaborate a little bit, any civil society is required to accommodate constructive disagreement, because it is impossible to achieve full homogenization of culture and values without some degree of coercion. And coercion is bad. There are certain forms of coercion that I think are okay. For example, coercion to which you submit voluntarily. Someone who submits himself to his church, for example, subjects himself to church discipline so that a church may excommunicate him if he acts improperly according to church discipline standards. I think that's a permissible form of coercion. But in civil society, in public and political life, which is a different sphere, I think what we have to try to do is keep disagreement and conflict, which are inevitable, at the level of rhetoric and discourse rather than physical violence or coercion. And can we ever do that perfectly? No, I don't think so. All we can do is our best. But human beings are flawed creatures. We make mistakes, we pursue power, we have sometimes good ambition and sometimes bad ambition, but we make mistakes, and we have limited faculties. We have limited understanding and sort of circumscribed knowledge of local circumstances, and that prevents us from being able to make fully informed decisions. So we're going to mess up. I think to the extent that toleration is possible, we need to pursue it. The problem is, in the United States in particular, a lot of the cries for toleration come from the most intolerant people who are seeking with all their might to impose their views on other people. And one example of this is the diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates that you see across the United States are ironic, because the acronym DEI ends up meaning something very different. Rather than diversity, the D stands for uniformity of opinion. Anybody who thinks outside of this scope is intolerable. Equity means inequality. It means unequal treatment. It means discriminating against people on the basis of race, which is an immutable characteristic, something you did not choose, something you were born into the world with. And then inclusion actually means exclusion, exclusion of anyone who disagrees with us. And so a term that sounds very happy and moral and virtuous is actually loaded with ideological freight that is highly problematic and that undermines any form of morality under which it seeks to justify itself. I hope that's a helpful response.
I have a question, and it's more about like good morals and liberty do a good market when you where you can like trade in a more moral way. But I have noticed that people tend to be or tend to diverge and be more immoral in a way when they have more liberty. So I have more like a question: how can we be liberal, tolerant, but at the same time like try to tell people no, we don't have to be immoral in this aspect, and they don't respond like, no, you have to accept me just as immoral as I am. That's my question.
That's a very great question. I mentioned Thoreau. I also love Emerson. I think he's right about the awesome power of human faculties. I think humans have astounding, awesome abilities to reason, but we have limitations and we need restraints. And I think one answer to your question is establishing intermediary institutions that can form those sort of moral restraints on people. So I mentioned the church, for example. The church can properly exercise coercion over its members. There are many other mediating institutions that can serve that function, whether it's even becoming a social pariah or shunning bad behavior. And I think there are social incentives that people respond to just as they respond to economic incentives. Now, do I have some panacea, some miracle pill that we can all take and all of a sudden we become more morally virtuous people? No, I don't. And I don't necessarily believe that becoming highly educated leads to more moral society either. Some of the worst people I've ever known are in universities, and they're professors, and they're terrible people. And just because they know a lot doesn't make them more virtuous. So I don't think that's the answer either. I think that's probably the biggest challenge is how do you cultivate virtue and morality in society? And, I think these things somebody mentioned cycles earlier. I do think these things run in cycles. I think sometimes some cultures and civilizations have to run aground before people say, okay, that went wrong. Some things went wrong. And interesting, you look at the decline and fall of the Roman Empire or any other ancient civilization. Yes, some fell to external invasion and colonization, etc. But many others fell through internal strife and internal decline. And it was almost as though economic decline and moral decline went hand in hand, just as economic growth and economic morality can go hand in hand as well. I love, the United States of America in the 19th century just shot up economically. But it was also a time when the United States embraced the Protestant work ethic, and people were very religious. And we had a lot of mediating institutions. And de Tocqueville observed, all the associations that made the United States distinct from European countries and that gave it energy and gave it life. And that contributed to sort of the industry of the United States. It was an exciting period of growth and expansion. And, the United States has not been that way in a long time. We sort of live in almost a static administrative bureaucracy in which previously cultural institutions have been supplanted by agencies and functionaries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.